Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. So some games have been played, and a lot more are still to come this weekend. I figured it was a good time to finish actually previewing this crazy season. It's been a strange few months, but I'm bringing on Cole Cubelek with ESPN and SEC Network. Cole will preview the SEC, which doesn't kick off until September 26th. We'll also talk to Cole about some issues facing college football at the beginning of the season and maybe throughout the season. How do teams prepare and what that will look like and how that might play out as the season goes along. I'll also bring on Chris Vannini from The Athletic, who will take us through the Group of Five conferences that are already up and running. The American, the Sun Belt, and Conference USA have all had teams play games already. We'll get a deeper dive into those leagues with Chris. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you get your podcasts. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is our friend Cole Cubelek. He is on the SEC Network and the and ESPN at times. I think he's got Iowa State and Louisiana this weekend, which is a pretty damn good game. And you'll catch him on WJOX. I got that right?
That's it. Three-man front, 10-2.
Three-man front, 10-2 out of Alabama. So that's Central Time on the 10-2. You can find Cole a lot of different places. He is one of the hardest working men in show business. Thanks very much for joining me, Cole. So before we get into an SEC preview, and nobody does a better job of digging into these teams than you, I do want to sort of take a look back at the weekend we just saw. Handful of games, not many competitive. We saw very varying degrees of readiness from a Navy team that looked like it had never played football before and really hadn't played football in a while, to a Middle Tennessee team that really looked very out of sorts, and an Army team that looked really sharp, though I think even some of the teams that looked good has to be balanced with the teams that they were playing looking so dysfunctional. So as we enter the next couple of weeks, and a lot of teams this weekend will be playing for the first time, I'm wondering how much we should expect the unexpected just because we don't know what teams have been doing on the road to playing regular season games.
I think you should expect a lot of unexpected. I think that this is a really intriguing discussion heading into the season for a lot of different reasons. We had Memphis and Arkansas State over the weekend. Arkansas State, Blake Anderson's bunch had 11 spring practices, and because of when school started, their fall camp wasn't really disrupted by the 20-hour rule, which takes place when you get back into school. Ryan Silverfield's group, a little bit different. They had no spring practices, and they could only have 9 legit fall camp practices because then school started and you're under the 20-hour rule. Things change a little bit. So I think you saw a Memphis team that's more talented, probably just better than Arkansas State, but still struggled for a half. And probably didn't go out there and do what a lot of people thought they were going to do with the returning quarterback in Brady White. A lot of that offensive line coming back and some weapons just all over the place. And then another intriguing portion of this, I think you brought up a good point on the opponents, and I do think we need to keep that in consideration with some of these. I think that's very real. But you look at an Arkansas State, they're going to play 2 quarterbacks this year. And I kind of wonder, will that become a little bit more of the standard? And maybe not just for quarterbacks. I think readiness is going to be a real topic that we need to discuss, that we definitely do discuss. Like Silverfield told us, he told his group, he said, listen, we're going to beat you up a little bit. We're going to pound you. We have to. We have to get our bodies acclimated for what's coming. Obviously, Ken Niumatalolo, after watching Navy's game against BYU, he took a completely different approach, and I think we all agree that it showed up. But then roster management also comes into play. And even though a lot of people probably look at this, Ralph, and say, well, if you got returning starters, especially returning quarterbacks, you'll be able to go out there and do what Shane Buechele did against Texas State and pitch it around and be successful. But I think even still, some of that timing, rhythm, continuity, chemistry has a chance to be off. So that depending on who you're playing, what they run, different things of that nature. But I think how you manage your roster is going to be the most difficult task of this particular college football season. Every team's got a transfer or two coming in. Every team lost a guy or two to transfer. Some of those, Arkansas State's got a linebacker that transferred in that's been on campus for 15 days and he started.
Right.
So things can change rapidly. And I think even more so now where you're going to have to cross-train your guys. You're going to have a guard who can play center or a tackle who can play both sides. You're going to have a fullback that can play some tight end or tight end that can be an H-back and maybe also flex. Receivers that can play, all 3 or 4 spots. A safety who can come play linebacker for a game. A D-end who could drop down and play defensive tackle for a game in an emergency situation. All this flexibility, I think, is going to end up being necessary for a lot of teams to begin with. Now, it's a luxury right now for Arkansas State. They have 2 quarterbacks that have played and they have confidence in. But, UAB did it the other night. They put the next guy in earlier in the game, kind of gave him some reps. And I'm just beginning to wonder, are we going to see more of that as we see more teams play? Especially teams that the week after next, we're going to see play that have already had games delayed. And you just wonder if their coaching staff is not sitting there thinking, we need to get multiple guys prepared. We need to be ready to lose a player at every position, and we need to have our emergency plan in place where if someone tests on a Friday, that we find out that they're not going to be able to play, because that's not a situation that a lot of coaches are used to dealing with, no matter how much depth you have. So I think you're going to see missed tackles. I saw a lot of guys putting the ball on the ground over the weekend. You're going to see quarterbacks sail balls. You're going to see receivers run the wrong routes. O-linemen are going to bust assignments. All those things are going to happen. And that's just because the physical acclimation period has not been what it's normally been. And that's not just practice. That's not just going through spring ball and taking guys to the ground, which I think when I hear live practice, I think take guys to the ground. So I think you can go do a lot of the other physical stuff without actually tackling people in practice. And a lot of coaches would not consider that a full live practice. But it's not just missing spring ball. It's not just that some of these fall camps are going to be light, but also keep in mind the physical conditioning of these players. Mm-hmm. It's not where it's normally been. These guys are working out with weight vests and bands and body weight work. Brady White's telling us that he's doing squats with his dog. That
was funny, by the way. Yeah, that was cute.
Yeah, and their strength coach told me they had another player that sent him a video, like he was doing body weight squats with his girlfriend, like piggyback riding him and walking down the street. It's just these kids have had to do anything they could get their hands on and anything in a creative manner to stay in shape. So their bodies are not as well conditioned as they were last year, the year before, if you're a 3rd, 4th year guy. So I think all that begins to come into play as to what we should expect the first few weeks of the season. I think we always see different teams week 1 to 2, Ralph. Mm-hmm. I think week 1 to 2 this year for individual teams is going to be maybe more different than we've ever seen it before.
Well, I'll even add this then, because what I've been asking coaches lately is if you can't practice for how many practices could you lose during a week? And not because, there's 2 different reasons. A, you might not have enough kids to practice. But if you don't have enough kids to practice, there's a good chance you're not going to have enough kids to play. So let's sort of put that aside. But what I asked Lincoln Riley and Tom Herman and Brian Kelly at various times was, what if you just your doctors come to you and say, you can't practice today because we have to do contact tracing. We got a couple of kids came back positive, and we may be good to go tomorrow, but we need you to pause for today. And if you lose 1 day, maybe 2 of practice during a week, like you could still and will probably still want to play on Saturday. But what does that look like when you end up playing on Saturday? So I think that could be the case for a lot of this year. There's 2 things. There's A, if you lose practices during the week because you have to put a little pause here for contact tracing and things along those lines. And B, the other part of it is, and as someone who played a lot, Cole, I'll ask you about this. If you've been sitting in quarantine for 14 days, what kind of a player are you coming back as? Now, some coaches have told me they might be able to provide some quarantine workouts for kids who are not positive but are in quarantine, maybe with, by themselves with a strength coach who has already had it or something along those lines. But I also worry about those kids coming out of quarantine that just haven't done anything for 2 weeks? And if you have a bunch of those, what does your team look like? So there's a lot of things that I feel like going forward this season will make this it's already a very weird year, but I think that the level of play could be dramatically different from teams from week to week.
I agree. And just total sidebar, we've seen the CDC change their guidelines as far as asymptomatic patients and testing positive 2 different times since the NCAA put in those contact tracing guidelines. And we haven't seen the NCAA budge on those. Mm-hmm. Me personally, I would like to see them revisit that, because I understand that it's a gigantic CYA move. And I think it was partially a move to satisfy a lot of people who cover college football and what they sort of the optics of it, I guess. But I do think it needs to be reevaluated. It's too much. It's way too much. So like you just said, you go send a kid home for 14 days. I don't care if you're giving him an entire weight room. He's not doing all the things that he needs to do.
So what I'll say is, with a wife who's an epidemiologist, what she'll tell you is, you could test out. There's ways of, or maybe sort of testing out. Though the CDC,
like what the PGA is doing.
Yeah, though the CDC hasn't really recommended that, and I think the NCAA was more concerned about recommending that because they felt like that could put certain teams at a competitive disadvantage because they might not be able to afford all the testing. Now, that's not really the case anymore. Testing seems to be more available and cheap enough so that there could be something along those lines. Again, my wife will tell you, because of the asymptomatic nature of this, and you can pass it along asymptomatically, she would be probably more inclined to, like, again, this is just not necessarily just a football setting, but just in general, that we should probably take the more conservative approach in just the population in general. But you're right. I mean, the fact that it's been, and the other part of it is too, like the CDC has tweaked some of these a little bit, but ultimately it's on your local health department to determine what the standard is going to be. Because again, she works for a local health department here in New York, the New York City Health Department. So the CDC will give its recommendations, but a state might say, listen, we don't like our positivity rates here, and we're just going to say, like, no, we're going to be a little more conservative. So anyway, I mean, this is where college football is, of course, in 2020. Like, you're dealing with, what does the CDC say? What does a local health department say? And how does that all translate into the football field? I think it's fair to say, like, maybe it would be better if it was more of a 7 to 10 days. But let me ask you about the practice piece. As someone, again, who played high-level football at Auburn for 4 years, if you miss, I mean, what does it mean for a team to miss a day or two of practice? Like, what does that look like?
I think a lot of that depends on where you are in the season. If we're week 8, we're good. I think if you're week 8, you could probably have one practice in a week, still get your conditioning in, and probably feel better when you went out and played. If it's week 2 or 3, especially this year with all those other things we talked about, then yeah, now you're talking about a real problem. Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about you're more than likely going to have to play some other guys, and I don't think you're not going to be. It goes back to physical acclimation. You're not going to be prepared physically to do the things that a college football game requires you to do. Any football player will tell you they'll go out and try, and they're going to give it their best effort, but they're just not as prepared as they need to be. Definitely not as prepared as they have been. If you got depending on what day you had off, Sunday, Monday, you go get a hard Tuesday practice in and sort of a lighter walkthrough Thursday. You could get a walkthrough on Friday at the team hotel, no pads, nothing, just kind of a refresher in what you were going to see. See, at that point in time, it really comes down more to your opponent than yourself the later you get in the year. Earlier in the year, it's still on you, and you still need the reps, and you still need the work, and you still need to feel what it's going to be like. So I think there would be a great impact. You could still squeeze it in. You could find a way to make it work. I think that's where depth becomes key again, because if you're a team that goes fast and you've been missing these days of practice, well, you've been missing conditioning because that's how you practice. So are you even physically able to withstand 80, 85 plays? Which some teams run. I don't know if you would be.
It's weird. It's going to be. Yeah, it's also going to be. It's also going to be weird too, because I think as the season progresses, the teams that avoid, forget even like canceling games, but the teams that are able to just proceed along each week in a normal fashion, that doesn't have a practice canceled here or a few players out there or a few players out there. Ultimately by the time we get to week 8 or 9, those may be the teams that have built up cohesiveness and some continuity. It's just going to be such a weird deal, man. It's just going to be such a weird deal.
I'll add this to it as well, and this could be something to sort of watch. Take Coach Grimes' plan against Navy. Now BYU, basically the blueprint of their offense, the structure, the foundation of that offense was outside zone stretch play, which can hit outside the front side tackle. So if you're running it to the left, it can go outside the tight end to the left. That thing could cut back all the way behind your left tackle or to your right tackle, like literally cut all the way back. And I think they had 4 big explosive plays that hit in 4 different places off that play. Well, if you rep that and you know that play, you can easily build everything around that play. But you know how to run that play. And because of what that play makes the defense do, you're going to be able to run bootlegs, play action, screens, throwbacks. You get your shots down the field because of what the defense has to do to adjust and stop that particular play. So if you can make that one go, which I know the mantra on Twitter last night was bully ball and knocking them around. And there was a portion of that was true, but there was a larger portion of what BYU that was doing that was execution and how they were executing those blocks and how they had an understanding of when to climb to the second level. All those things also come into play. We can't just go learn how to run outside zone in a week. I mean, it needs to be sort of who you are. And you look at teams like Louisville, App State, Boise, Louisiana. Those are teams that sort of, they really build off that play. Then you can add a counter, then you can add a power, you can add some other creative stuff with quarterback runs. But I think the teams that have, I don't like saying an easier foundation, but a more simplified foundation to their offense may be further ahead this year than in other years. If you build your offense around, let's say you're an RPO-based offense, and that's got to go for you to basically be successful, or you're an air raid team that throws the ball 65 times. I think there are more things that need to be worked across the course of a calendar year for those things to be successful than if I'm going to go run outside zone 25 times. And I know the things that I can build off that a little bit easier than I can some of those other offenses. So maybe the better way to say it is the offenses that are lower risk in nature may have a much better chance to be successful this year because of all the things that you just mentioned. Okay,
so now let's jump into the SEC then. Big picture here, before I start getting into specific teams, I'll ask you the big picture question of sort of with the backdrop of what you just said, is there anybody within the SEC that makes you think, well, because of what they do and how long they have been doing it, I feel like they sort of fit the bill here of what you just explained, that more simplified offense and sort of know what they do. And the other part of that question is, are there teams that you are worried about because they just haven't had a chance to implement their stuff, especially if it's new stuff?
Sure. I think all the new coaches you have to be a little bit concerned about, for different reasons. So you take Sam at Arkansas, and I think Kendall Briles is a brilliant offensive mind. But if you're gonna spread it sideline to sideline, and the misconception about all those Baylor offenses is that they just threw the ball 70 times a game. They were run first offense.
Yeah, they did. Right. They took advantage of the numbers. Yep. Absolutely.
And I've had lengthy conversations with Jared Stidham about it before, and because he played in it before he got to Auburn, and he's like, listen, we wanted to run the ball first, and if we could run it every play, we would. But when you gave us one-on-ones, we were going to take them, and the more you gave them to us, the faster we would go, and the more we'd throw. So that was sort of that mindset. Well, number one, being able to go fast. Number two, being able to run the ball first. Yes, Raheem Boyd is going to be amazing, but I don't know if that offensive line's ready to be that just yet. I do think they have the receivers, and maybe Felipe Franks is that guy, but doing it the way it needs to be done is concerning to me. I think you look at Lane at Ole Miss and you say, we know he's got a good system. We know he can make it work, but do the pieces of the puzzle actually fit? Offensive line is going to be young. I think John Rice Plumlee is super dynamic. I think he's a better thrower than people give him credit for, but he was a perfect fit for that read option offense that they wanted to run last year. And Rich Rodriguez, I don't know if he's going to be able to complete the passes at a high enough clip for what Lane Kiffin wants to do. So that's a little bit concerning. And then obviously just the air raid and Mike Leach, you got a veteran quarterback, albeit he didn't get there until the summer. You got a pretty good group of skill players out wide, and obviously Kylan Hill in the backfield. I think they can have a good offensive line, but that feels to me one, even though you'll get all these people that'll tell you, oh, they only have 4 plays or 6 plays. I mean, I asked Leach about it on our show in Birmingham, and he immediately began to expand upon, well, yeah, it might sound that way, but you can do 3 things off this. You can do 4 things off that. You can do 2 things off this. I mean, it expands fairly quickly. And I think a lot of those short intermediate throws, those are almost more rhythm, timing, understanding where the ball needs to be, even though nobody else is there, than a lot of the other offenses you're going to see in this league. So those would immediately be concerning. Georgia would be concerning because you got a quarterback that hadn't been there very long, an offensive coordinator that hadn't been in college very long, and you exchange some personnel. Like, yeah, you got a George Pickens. I think you got a stable of backs that are going to be fine. You still have enough talent up front on the offensive line. I think Matt Luke was a brilliant hire for Kirby Smart, not just from an offensive line prowess perspective and working with those guys, but think about it. He's worked with Cutcliffe and done pro style. He's worked with Freeze and done more spread. And then he's done spread option with Rich Rodriguez. I mean, he brings 3 very unique stylistic approaches to offensive football. I think he's going to be a very valuable sounding board for that offense. So I think all those are very concerning, depending on what Eli wants to try to do at Missouri. I don't think he has the kind of guy that he really wants or needs to have right now to truly be successful. I look at what Chaney does at Tennessee, and I think they have a chance with a really good offensive line. Trey Smith's the best offensive lineman that's going to play football this year. I think at Alabama, even though they're more of an RPO-based team last year, I think the percentage of run versus pass will lean more run this year with Mac Jones just not being – and this is – I don't mean this in a negative way at all, but like Tua played an egotistical style of football because he knew he could make some of those throws. Mm-hmm. Like you see windows that he completed balls and you're like, no, hand it off. There's a double team push that's going 4 yards down the field. And then boom, he hits this literally like barely like a football trophy case size, like one of those boxes you have. There's the only place it could fit on your desk. And that's where it hits the receiver in the hands and they go 80. Like, I don't think you have a guy that has that mindset, but you do have the offensive line and you do have the running backs to be a team that goes up there and just leans on people. And then I think you take a team like Florida. They're going to throw the ball a little bit more. They're going to run the ball through the air, which is a little bit less it's a little less high percentage of an offensive play than actually handing it off. But they got a guy that makes great decisions. And I think they've all been around it. They know the timing. They know the rhythm. They know the expectation. And Kyle Trask he almost knows before it happens what Dan Mullen wants and needs him to do inside that offense. I think the toss-up in that scenario would be Jimbo, because that is not a simple offense. Yeah. There's nothing about it that is simplistic. And I don't know how much more simple he will ever allow it to go. But he's got a guy that we know can run it. He's going to have a pretty good offensive line. He's going to have really good skill guys. So that could be – I think that's one that's really interesting to watch because – they're going to run the stretch play. Jimbo will tell you, we're going to run outside zone, and we're going to try to build play action off that. We're going to use the tight end, even though they've had a couple injured in camp. They still have Weidermeyer, who was excellent last year. So that'll give you some high percentage throws. And you can add quarterback runs, which I think of all those that we talked about, if you can take the ones that we think are going to be good, and then you can add some quarterback run stuff, some quarterback mobility stuff, that's going to be stealing this year because defenses are just going to play you in a different way. I could see him being overly aggressive. I can see him forgetting about things. And then it's also easier to just say, hey, check the quarterback counter and just run it. Check the quarterback inside zone. Just keep it and try to lean forward and get us 2 yards and get a first down. I think those bailout plays, so to speak, are going to be very valuable for a lot of college football teams.
Okay, so one of the teams that you left off there, and maybe the most there's a few, but I think the most interesting team in the conference is LSU because they were one of the great teams we have seen in college football last year. But most of that is gone. This is no knock to Ed Orgeron or any of the talent left behind because they will always have talent at LSU. But they just lost a remarkable amount of playmakers and brain power. So where does LSU fall on this continuum when you have two new a new coordinator and a half maybe because Brady's not there, though I think that probably slights Emzinger a little bit if you sort of say like Brady was the brains behind that. But new quarterback, and again, all that's gone at LSU. What do you make of LSU? They were number 5 in the preseason poll for whatever that's worth, or number 6, excuse me. And then they lost a couple of more players from that. Is it too much to expect LSU to even contend for an SEC West title, considering you still have Alabama, Auburn, and A&M to go through?
Yeah, you say a couple more players, but one was probably the best offensive player in the country, not named Trevor Lawrence.
Right, and Jamar Chase, right.
The other was an absolute boulder of a defensive tackle in the middle of that defense that you could sort of build everything around. Now, you got another guy in Apuika who I think can sort of take a little bit of the load off there. Glenn Logan's going to play inside. He can help them a lot. I like the linebacker. Let's just do this with LSU. And I think this is what we tend to forget to do sometimes, Ralph, is we look at everything that's gone, and it's easy to lay the focus on that. They were just drafted. They had this magnificent season. We know their names because they've been around. What's coming back that you like about this football team? And now defensive line depth is a real concern. Neil Farrell's gone. Tyler Shelvin's gone. You lose the other guys that just graduated. That's not going to be what it needs to be. But I look at Jabril Cox coming from North Dakota State. He's a sideline-to-sideline guy that can just absolutely burn. I think Damone Clark is in a position to do exactly what Patrick Queen did last year. And people wondered, well, who's this Patrick Queen guy? We never heard of him. Well, the number 5 pick was in front of him the year before. So some of these guys just don't get the opportunity to play a whole lot. I absolutely love Jacoby Stevens. Jacoby Stevens, to me, is the guy that I don't know why nobody talks about him. When you put the film on of LSU last year, he was constantly around the football. He was constantly making plays, second on the team in tackles, but just nobody wanted to talk about him. You put he in that backfield with Derek Stingley and a couple of the other guys that are coming on at safety and corner. They really like Maurice Hampton. I talked a lot to Dave Aranda last year about Cordell Flott, a young man out of Saraland, Alabama. And Dave just raved about him last year. Loved his football IQ, how quickly he learned things, and really thought he was going to be a great player. So I think the secondary's fine. I think linebacker's fine. I don't know if you have the depth up front on the defensive line, and I think you're missing that Caleb Chasson, that elite edge pass rusher. I don't think you have that guy. But you do have some things to work with and a bit of a foundation to build upon defensively. Now, on offense, the offensive line won the Joe Moore Award last year, and they've got some guys back that have played. Chess and Hines has played a little bit. Ed Ingram played a lot of ball for them last year. Decula started every game at right tackle. So I don't think they're as completely depleted of talent there. But, man, when I look at what's gone from the skill position, it's hard for me to imagine that it can even be a force to be reckoned with. I'm not going to compare it to last year because we can make a legitimate argument that that's the best offense college football has ever seen last year. And I think the main reason that they're in the discussion as the best team is who they did it against. There have not been many resumes of an undefeated national championship team that have faced what LSU faced last year, especially where they faced some of those teams. But you get Marshall back. Obviously, he had some production last year. I'm really excited to see Eric Gilbert at tight end, the number 1 player in the nation last year, who I think they're going to essentially force feed him the ball. He's going to play. This is not going to be a feeling out process of maybe he can help, maybe he won't. He's their starting tight end, and I think they're going to target him. And at least Miles Brennan's been in the system. He knows it. He's been around it. So I think there's some positives to build upon. But I will tell you this. I thought LSU could be in the mix late for the SEC West before Jamar Chase and Tyler Shelvin left, and then that just sort of pushed me over the ledge. I was like, you know what, just not this year. I think they can still have a good season. I think they can still be a good team. Can they compete with Alabama to win the West? I do not see that anymore. This is just too much to replace, too different. One thing I think they do have going for them, too, is the culture. And oftentimes I think we see a team win a national title or go undefeated, have a great year. We say, well, you can't just live on that. But in this past offseason, I think that's actually a little more valuable. I think having the wherewithal, what it took, what it's like, having the leadership to say, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to carry ourselves. I think in that particular offseason, it's a little bit more valuable than what it normally would be. So I do think the culture is strong there. I think they've recruited well. I think you have a style that's been put in place offensively that's not going to go away. They're going to continue to play it. And I think they can still exceed some expectations, but I do not believe that they're a contender in the West anymore.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of with you. I fell over the edge when they lost Chase and Shelvin too. I mean, again, you're talking about 2 star-level players. So to lose those 2 on top of everything else, without question, there's enough raw material there for them to be, I'm not going to sit here and say LSU is going to be 5-5 or 4-6, but it only takes a couple of losses to sort of knock you out of contention, and all of a sudden you're now, maybe not even in the New Year Six, and who knows what the hell that looks like with the amount of teams that we have and whether we're going to have bowl games and things like that. But I'm just saying, within the context of the SEC West, between Alabama, still a pretty good Auburn team, an A&M team I think is finally going to take a step forward, that, you could be fourth in the SEC West and still be a top 15 team in the country. So,
sure.
and that's sort of where I am with LSU. I mentioned Auburn.
One thing they have going for them too,
yeah.
Ralph, is the schedule. They were
they got the
The
deal.
new schedule design. Because if you're going to get Mississippi State, I'd much rather have them week one when all you've been doing is sitting around and scouting your opponents all offseason anyway.
Yeah.
And that was one that they were going to scout no matter what. So they got that out of the way. And you don't really have any juggernauts back to back. Florida, Auburn, Alabama, A&M are all split between either a bye week or other games on the schedule. So you don't get that Titanic Goliath back-to-back matchups like some other teams in the league are going to get. So the schedule does favor LSU a little bit.
So let me talk about Auburn here, because Bo Nix was, a freshman quarterback. And the funny thing is, in today's day and age of college football, we've seen freshmen, redshirt freshmen, and even true freshmen step into these jobs and be so ready, right? And be so ready to produce. His freshman year was a little bit more like a traditional freshman year might be from a quarterback, which is some really nice moments and a lot of inconsistency, and a completion percentage, I believe, was in the mid-50s. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now. So there's certainly a lot of room for improvement there, and certainly glimpses of, that this is where that improvement can come from, that this could be a very good player. But you add that with, again, some changes on the offensive side, and we'll see what that means of Chad Morris being the offensive coordinator there. They certainly lost a ton of players on the defensive side and the front seven, in the front line, and some guys in the secondary. We haven't really touched on Auburn, so they didn't fit in any of the categories. But what do you think about Auburn as possibly being in the mix to challenge Alabama?
Yeah, an interesting team for sure. I have all the confidence in the world in Kevin Steele, their defensive coordinator. And he will have a good plan. He will have guys in position to make plays. I just don't think he has the playmakers up front that he did a year ago. As a matter of fact, I know he doesn't. There's no Derek Brown, who was a generational defensive lineman. You add him with Marlon Davidson, who was a great defensive lineman. And then obviously you had an opt-out in Connus Miller, who's not going to be around the team either. So now you got a lot of depth gone up front. You got playmaking ability gone up front. You have just destructive forces gone from your defensive line, which, as we know, makes everything else easier at the second and third levels. I think they have one of the best linebacking corps in the SEC, if not the nation, and that's even with Chandler Wooten opting out. Owen Popo and KJ Britt are going to be phenomenal. I think they're pretty good on the edge with Big Cat Bryant and Derek Hall and TD Moultrie. But I just don't know if that's going to be enough. There are guys in the secondary that are super talented. Smoke Monday, super talented. Christian Tut's sort of a nickel slot guy you can move around, do a lot of different things. But everyone focuses in on the loss of Brown and Davidson. And no one talks about Jeremiah Denson, Daniel Thomas, and Javaris Davis, who are three guys in that secondary that played a ton of football, a ton of snaps. And just because they didn't come off the board in the first or second round doesn't mean they weren't really good college football players. And what's going to be missing most is that wherewithal, that sixth sense, so to speak. And I talked to Kevin about that defense last year, and there were times that he told me, he's like, Cole, these guys can show a different look and then get back into what I called, or they can make a call and get to something else on their own. I don't have to overcoach these guys. They all understand what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and then they can take it to the next step and add a few things that we don't even talk about. Well, that's not going to be there. And by the way, I didn't even mention a first-round DB that's gone in Noah Igbignogany, who wasn't even super productive, but his athleticism just off the charts. I think all that gone is going to be tough for them to lean on the defense. They can't lean on the defense like they did last year. And you go back to Florida and you go back to LSU. You had a guy tweet in to the show the other day. We were talking about this, and he said, well, Bo Nix carried Auburn and almost won the game in Baton Rouge. I'm like, no, the defense carried Auburn in that game. Yeah. But I think with four new offensive linemen, it's going to be tough. There are weapons on offense. And, I mean, Seth Williams has every bit of the making of a number one receiver. Anthony Schwartz is one of the fastest players in college football, really in all of football. He's got to get more touches. I think Schwartz should be force-fed 8 to 10 touches a game. And there were times that he just disappeared, and I don't think that's his fault last year. I just think there wasn't a plan designed to make sure he got the ball. Shawn Shivers is explosive. They call him Worm. He's a guy that I think can provide explosive plays. Running back's interesting because DJ Williams is, I think, a little more than serviceable, but I don't know how explosive he is. Gus has done a little bit more with less at the running back position from a talent perspective. I mean, you think about Cameron Artis-Payne and Peyton Barber and guys that weren't household names that had really big years. So he can find a way to do that. And Bo Nix can take that next step. I mean, you mentioned being prepared. If there's ever a guy that should have been or could have been, I mean, it's the one whose dad wore the same number with the same name on the back of the same jersey at the same school. Like he should have been prepared. That was his coach, and he's been watching it and been around it his entire life. I'm very interested to see what the offensive design looks like. How much of it is really Chad Morris? Is he presented with a menu to call plays from? Is there a back and forth between play calls or play calling duties? Or is there any type of a hamstrung style or approach to how Chad Morris can actually go out and run this offense? If so, if there is a juggling act, so to speak, I think they get bogged down again. I don't think they're very good. If Jack McNeil can work some magic with the offensive line and Chad Morris really goes out there and just runs it his way, they got the talent to be pretty good on offense, and I think they need the offense to be pretty good. Because like I said, I don't think they can lean on the defense. The defense can be just good enough to keep them in and win a few games for them, but it can't be like last year where the defense is keeping them in every game and giving them positions to win every game, and then just some games they couldn't do it. But the offense has got to take big strides, and a lot of that's going to come down to who's actually designing it and calling it and how that offensive line looks.
Okay, we'll get to Alabama in a bit. Don't worry, Alabama fans, we're not going to forget you. But I want to head back over to the East because we've touched on a bunch of teams here, but there's one team that you've convinced me to like as much as anybody. Like, I'm on board with Kentucky now, and frankly, that's part of it. Is like I think I follow you a lot on Twitter, so I think you've kind of pushed me toward the Kentucky might be pretty good this year. And it's interesting because I think we look at Georgia, Florida, and those are sort of 1 and 1A, depending on how you want to put them. I generally have been Georgia 1, Florida 2, though, again, some of the uncertainty around Georgia with new quarterbacks and new offense has given me, quite frankly, if this was a normal offseason, I was probably getting prepared to pick Georgia to win a national championship, but that seems to be gone now. But toward the middle of the SEC East, who might be the next couple of teams? You mentioned Tennessee. You haven't mentioned Kentucky as much, but let's talk about those two teams and sort of give me Kentucky, Tennessee. Which one would be more likely to be a legit challenger to the top two?
I would probably say Kentucky right now. And there's a lot to like about Tennessee. A great offensive line. I think Wanye Morris is going to take a big step at tackle this year. I mentioned Trey Smith earlier. He's the best offensive lineman playing college football this year. Brandon Kennedy's got a ton of snaps at center at both Alabama and Tennessee. So he's a guy that has all the wherewithal to be able to handle it. The Cade Mays thing still seems like it's up in the air, but man, if they got him back at guard, they would be a legit force to be reckoned with. I think Tennessee still has pretty good skill, but Jared Garantano's got to stop throwing the ball to the other team. I mean, that's just the reality. He can't go out and put up 500 against Missouri and then come out and throw 3 or 4 picks the next week against a different team. He needs consistency. He needs leadership from that position. And I think defensively, you lost some real star power that not a lot of people really talk about. I think that when you look at what they had last year off the edge in Darrell Taylor, it was better than people thought. I think Batuli was better than people thought at linebacker. I think Nigel Warrior was better than people thought at safety last year. I'm a little concerned about the middle of the defense as far as the depth is concerned. With Emmett Gooden being gone, I just don't know if they have enough legitimate SEC interior defensive linemen that can go out and be disruptive and make plays on a regular basis. But I think I love both of the schemes, offensively and defensively, and I think Jeremy is a magnificent in-game coach. I just look at the foundation of how Kentucky is built right now, and that is being physical up front on the offensive and defensive line. They have the best center in Drake Jackson in the SEC. two tackles that have played a lot, Darian Kennard and Landon Young. Luke Fortner's played some at guard on this team. He gets it. And you bring Terry Wilson back, who 2 years ago was their starting quarterback, started last season as a starting quarterback. So he has a ton of experience. And now Eddie Gran with some legitimate weapons behind him. If you hadn't seen A.J. Rose play, he is every bit of a legitimate SEC downhill runner. You add Cavassier Smoke and Christopher Rodriguez, who is super explosive. And now I think Eddie Gran, the offensive coordinator, gets to sort of mix and match. Okay, what do I want to be? Do I want to be that sort of hybrid wishbone that we finished the season with Lynn Bowden as? Do I want to go back to more of a spread-based formation and go 3, 4, 5 wide? Maybe draw up some stuff for my quarterback to be able to run the ball at times. He's going to have a lot of different ways that he can beat you. And this coaching staff has kept a lot of the continuity together, and they have consistently developed talent. And, 2 years ago, they had a basketball player on the team that everyone expected to do big things. Coming from Iowa, he did nothing. And then last year he goes out there and he's a pretty integral part of what they did, Ahmad Wagner. So they find ways to, even the guys that don't show up right away, still be able to develop them where they can help down the road. And the one guy that gets no credit, not enough credit, but no credit, is Brad White, the defensive coordinator. They finished number 4 in pass defense last year. And they got a couple of big physical corners coming back, which that's what Stoops is going to do. He's going to recruit big corners. And they got some guys up front like DeAndre Square and Boogie Watson, who I think can be disruptive. They have a boatload of experience, a boatload of big game experience. And I think they are a team that's built for physicality. They are built to be able to go to war with you. And if they have to win up front, they're going to be able to do that. They're going to match up or be more physical with every other team in the league. And a quarterback that has some experience with weapons around him, and an offensive coordinator that has shown he can be very different at times and find ways to be successful. I think this Kentucky team is really dangerous. I don't think they can win the East with their schedule, but I think they absolutely can exceed everybody's expectations. And I think that game week 1 at Auburn is a gigantic swing game. I mean, there was a time, Ralph, in the SEC probably like right around the Cam era, 2010, like 2008 to 2012-ish, 13-ish, right around there, where that Auburn-Mississippi State game was kind of the fork in the road game for both those teams.
Yeah.
Like you thought they could both be good, but you needed to see that game, and then the winner usually went on to do some good things, and the loser went on to not have as great of a year. I mean, Cam, they had no business winning that game in Starkville in 2010. Nick Marshall needed to hit C.J. Uzoma on a little wheel route with like a minute and a half left in Jordan-Hare Stadium in 2013, the year Auburn went to the national title game. So I think this year the Kentucky game is that game for Auburn and Kentucky. I think the winner of that game will exceed our expectations and have a pretty good year. And the loser, they might be scratching and clawing just to put together a season that's somewhat acceptable.
All right, let's finish up with Alabama here. We didn't talk Vanderbilt. I mean, the one good thing is because all these athletic departments are broke, it might get Derek Mason another season, but I don't think Vanderbilt's going to win a whole lot of ball games here. But let's get you out on this one. Let's get you out on Alabama. We know they're going to be really good again. They were really good last year, but, listen, a couple of games didn't break their way. That had not happened at Alabama in such a long time. It was stark to see it happen. They had some defensive issues last year relative to what Alabama usually has. So let's just start with that one, and maybe we'll focus on that. How does Alabama quote unquote, fix its defensive issues this year? Is it just a matter of Dylan Moses coming back and giving those linebackers some stability and plus some experience gained by the guys who were forced into action last year?
I think it's a little bit more than that, but he is an integral part of it. I think not having his voice, not having his intellect on the field definitely limited what they were able to do. And we can go back to any Nick Saban defense, and they always seemingly have that guy. Even a Sean Dion Hamilton who doesn't have the draft or the NFL prowess was somebody who could handle that and be that guy in the middle, whether it was Reuben Foster, Reggie Ragland. That guy has always been a special player and then a special voice for the team as well. Getting guys lined up, getting into different things, making checks, just being the alpha on that defense. And once Dylan was gone, they didn't have that. But also look at the fact that late in the year, DJ Dale was banged up. Well, Brian Ray missed the second half of the season, and Christian Barmore didn't really break out until the last maybe quarter of the season. All of a sudden, if you get a healthy or mostly healthy LeBron Ray, DJ Dale, Christian Barmore, that can become the strength of your defense, maybe the strength of your football team.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Barmore is going to be special. I think DJ Dale's solid. And LeBron Ray looked like he was going to be the next guy even 2 years ago. So all of a sudden, the defensive line that was sort of suspect and questionable at times, especially late when those guys were all nicked up for Alabama last year, could become the strength of the team. I'm a little concerned about a guy like Xavier McKinney being gone because he's one of those ultimate Nick Saban stamp of approval guys. There's only been 4 or 5, maybe 3, 4 that Nick Saban has just sort of considered another son when he's coaching them. And
can I guess? Guess here? Minka obviously is one.
He was definitely one.
Is Barron one?
I don't think Mark Barron was one of those.
Okay. Who else beyond Minka? So Minka, you got McKinney, Minka.
I actually think Rolando McClain was one
of
those
course.
Guys,
okay. Yeah. I'll buy that.
So,
okay.
But there's always there's been a few of those guys that this extra stamp of approval that Nick kind of openly gives. And Xavier McKinney was one of those guys. And he did a lot of things for that defense, not just 95 tackles and 3 picks, but he was a blitzer. He played the run. He could cover the slot. He could play man. He did a lot of different things. And not having that on the back end, I am concerned about sort of how that looks. But I think with Patrick Surtain on one side, and be it Josh Jobe or Jordan Battle in other areas of coverage needs, I think they have enough there to be fine. I do think they're going to need a disruptor, a pass rusher. It doesn't always have to be on the edge. Quentin Williams sort of proved that. And I think you've had a few other guys that have sort of proved it doesn't have to be an edge rusher. Jonathan Allen proved that he could be just as disruptive and cause as many problems, rushing inside. But they do not have an edge presence, and it's going to have to be. I don't think Ray and Dale are that loose, but Barmore would probably have to be that guy that just if he gets one-on-ones, he's got to win them, especially in pass situations to make life a little bit easier. If they don't get that, I could see the defense maybe falling into some of the traps that they did last year, but I think the offense is going to have enough to make up for it. So I'm not sure if it matters.
Give me a pick, and listen, again, it's going to be a weird year, or it has the potential to be a very weird year where we could see some results that look odd because of disruptions to practice time and players being out and things along those lines. So I'm not holding you to any of this, was what I'm trying to say, Cole. I'm not holding you to any of this. It's going to be a tough year to see what to foresee what might be coming. But, all things being equal, who do you think plays in the SEC title game, and who do you think wins the SEC?
I think it's Alabama and Florida, and I think Alabama wins the SEC championship. They are. You think about it just from an opt-out perspective. We've heard almost nothing coming out of Tuscaloosa as far as guys opting out. So that hurdle has not been one that really affected Alabama. The key players in key positions coming back, whether it's Najee Harris at tailback, Mac Jones at quarterback, Smith and Waddle at wide receiver, Waddle especially helping in special teams. We mentioned the D linemen that are going to be back. Key positions that I think mean a little bit more this season that they're just going to have big advantages with that a lot of other guys are not. I think that this team's focused, and I think that they have more talent than everybody they're going to play. That includes if they were to play Georgia right now. So I'll go Alabama winning the West. I think Florida finds a way to win the East, and I think Alabama will be a little bit too much in an SEC championship game.
Cole Cubelek, you can find him on the SEC Network, on ESPN, and on WJOX coming out of Alabama. 3-man front, which is 10 to 2 Central Time, right? 10 to 2 Central on 3-man front?
Correct. That's
Excellent.
It. Yep.
You can catch Cole a lot of different places. As you can tell, he gives you a lot of great information. He knows this stuff better than anybody. Hey, man, really appreciate your time. I know you got another call. I'm going to let you go. Roll to that. And, again, thanks for all the information. Good luck this weekend in Ames, Iowa.
Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate the time. Always good catching up.
Joining me next on the podcast is Chris Vannini from The Athletic. He does an excellent job covering not just a Group of Five conference, but all the Group of Five conferences in a really in-depth way. So go to The Athletic and find Chris if you are a big fan of one of those teams or one of those conferences. Chris, thanks so much for joining me. And there are 3 Group of Five conferences going into the fall. Most of them have had teams play, or I think there was a little Sun Belt, little Sun Conference USA, and a little American this past weekend. So we've gotten a little taste of those conferences, and a lot more to come. Thanks for joining me. And let's talk Group of Five.
Yeah, we've had games played. We've had a coaching change. There's been a lot that has happened in the Group of Five in 1 week.
Okay, since we got to touch on the news, let's touch on that. So Jay Hobson, who was Southern Miss's coach, probably the most notable thing he did at Southern Miss, and he didn't do a bad job at Southern Miss. He had over 500 record at that school, and it was, the school hasn't been as successful as it has been back in the heyday when I was in Mississippi covering them, but generally a pretty good program that generally does pretty well in Conference USA. He has had a pretty okay run, but really the thing that he got the most attention for while he was down in Hattiesburg was for trying to hire Art Briles as the offensive coordinator. Now, that did not happen, and it was kind of an embarrassment for the university when the president and the AD said, no, you can't do that. So I guess I wonder, after he gets fired after what was a really bad performance against South Alabama last weekend, I guess it was last Thursday, I don't know how much you've had a chance to dig into this, but how much do you think there was a relationship that sort of broke back when the Briles things happened and maybe, sort of culminated in this awkward early season firing?
Yeah, the relationship with the administration was not good. Not only did he, look into hiring Briles without really telling the school, he also tried to bring in some players with troubled backgrounds onto the team without informing the school as well. My colleague Nicole Auerbach wrote that at the time last year. Things had been dicey for a while. It's an AD who didn't hire him. Fans had been upset. And then, last month they had several players not only opt out of the season, but transfer out, and some notable defensive starters as well, including defensive end Jacques Turner. So things were clearly not going in a good direction coming into the year. And then they looked really bad in that first game against South Alabama, lose at home. And now a change is made 1 week into the season, in a year in which we did not think many coaches would be fired because of the financial situation. But as always, college football manages to surprise us.
And they hired a interim coach, Scotty Walden, who's got an interesting background. And if you're again, as you just made reference to, we are thinking that this is going to be a pretty quiet coaching carousel type year because finances generally, nobody's going to want to pay buyouts this year. So we're thinking this is going to be a pretty quiet year. Southern Miss throws that away and gets rid of their guy a game into the season. Again, my suspicion would be they are probably going to try to make this a pretty affordable hire, which makes me very interested about Scotty Walden because, again, super young guy, but also an intriguing background and the type of guy who, if given the opportunity, and he does pretty well this year, I'm sure Southern Miss might think, yeah, we can write this guy a $500,000 a year check, and he might be our head coach. So give me a little background on Scotty Walden.
Yeah, Walden was the offensive coordinator at East Texas Baptist, a Division III school in the early 2010s, and had one of the best offenses in Division III football. He becomes the head coach in 2016 at 26 years old, youngest head coach in the NCAA, and he goes 7-3 in that first year, and they lead the country in scoring, 49 points per game. And from there, after 1 year there, he joined the Southern Miss staff as, I think, the inside receivers coach. And he's kind of worked his way up since, became the co-offensive coordinator. So this is certainly an audition for the job and a guy I would certainly give a shot at winning it. I think he's, Jay Hobson was only making $500,000. He was the lowest paid public school coach in Conference USA. Now Scotty Walden is only making, I think, a little more than $100,000. And, what the Jay Hobson buyout may or may not end up being, we're not totally sure yet. So this could potentially save them some money as well. And if moving forward, you imagine he'd be a pretty cheap option if he does enough to win the job.
Yeah, it's an interesting program in that, again, it's been one of these sort of left behind programs.
Yep.
It wasn't interesting enough to move to a bigger conference frankly, because it's a very small market. But at its best, it's in a good place to get players. It's as simple as that. I mean, the Southern Miss has always been well positioned to grab interesting players and athletes from the Gulf Coast and throughout, not necessarily too much in northern Mississippi, but if you go throughout the Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle, like Southern Miss gets some players. So you can go there and be like a Larry Fedora did and be successful and launch yourself and Todd Monken into other jobs. But it's also not a program that does very much revenue-wise, so it will struggle along those lines, but it has the basis of players. We'll see if it can draw anybody. But again, I imagine it's probably not going to be a place where you're going to spend a lot of money. Anybody else, just before we jump into some of the other games and teams around the group of 5 that are playing, let's wrap a bow on USM. Anybody else you think might be a possibility there, even though it's super early? So who knows how this develops as a coaching search. But what are the names that maybe come to mind?
Yeah, this could go a number of ways, but another guy I think who could really get a look is Will Hall. He's the offensive coordinator at Tulsa. He's former head coach at Division II West Alabama and Division II West Georgia, where he had a really good record at both of those schools. And he did a good job as the OC at Tulane last year. His first year, they improved quite a bit on offense, and we'll have to see how this year plays out. Maybe you kick the tires on Todd Monken and Larry Fedora again. Monken's the offensive coordinator at Georgia. Fedora's the offensive coordinator at Baylor. Maybe those guys, if they want another head coaching job, come look back. Maybe not. Hugh Freeze is an interesting idea. He's a Southern Miss grad. He obviously knows the state, coached at Ole Miss. But you imagine he's making pretty decent money at Liberty, and would he be willing to give that up to take a job in a conference? Because Liberty's in a tough spot. Liberty went 8-5 as an independent last year, reached their first bowl game. Some other names: Rich Rodriguez. He wants a head coaching job. He was the OC at Ole Miss last year. Tyrone Nix is a former Southern Miss linebacker, now the DC at UTSA. Maybe Pete Golding, the DC at Alabama. So this is a job that could get a lot of interesting names taking a look at it. Whether or not those folks will pull the trigger, not sure. And really in an ultimate what if moment here for Southern Miss, in 2016, Todd Monken leaves a week before signing day to go to the Tampa Bay Bucks. And Southern Miss looks at hiring Bill Clark, the head coach at UAB. UAB had gone 6-6 in his first year, and then they cut the program, and then they were going to bring it back. So in the middle of this rebuild, while UAB doesn't really have a roster, doesn't have games on the schedule, Southern Miss looks at hiring him, and he ended up turning them down. And now UAB is one of the top programs in Conference USA, new stadium on the way, bunch of new amenities in that program, and Southern Miss is kind of floundering around 500 once again. So it's really kind of what could have been there for Southern Miss, but it's a program with a long tradition of history, proud tradition, and you can't just win. You got to win a lot, and Hobson didn't win enough, and now they're looking for a new coach.
Let's just stay in Conference USA because it has become, you can make an argument that at this point it may be the weakest of the FBS conferences. Now, it's probably got a little more depth than the Sun Belt, literally does, in that there are more teams in Conference USA. But the top of the Sun Belt has established some pretty strong perennial contenders in App State and Louisiana. Whereas, the cool thing about Conference USA is it's a, spin the wheel, make your own adventure, right? I mean, almost every year you're going to have, you get some pretty drastic swings from some of these teams from sort of the middle to the top of the conference. There are some sort of perennial cellar dwellers, but there's a fair amount of upward mobility in the conference too. Looks like Western Kentucky might be at it again as far as being good. And UAB has almost become the one most consistent program in the conference. We saw a little bit of UAB. They looked pretty darn good in their opening game against Central Arkansas. Yes, that was Central Arkansas's second game because Central Arkansas is playing everybody this year. Where do you think we're looking at sort of the contenders in Conference USA?
I've got UAB as the favorite. They bring something like 18 total starters back. Last year was supposed to be a rebuild. They win the conference somehow in 2018, 2 years removed from completely restarting the program. They win the conference in a Cinderella story. They lose a ton, especially defensively last year, but they had a very easy schedule. They got some scheduled breaks in the conference as well, and they win the division. Ended up getting plastered by FAU in the title game. But they come into this year with a lot of experience on both sides of the ball. 2 years in a row, they've probably had the best defense in the league. Quarterback, they like Tyler Johnston. He was a little bit shaky in that first game, and it looked like he might have gotten banged up. So they do have multiple guys kind of in the mix there at quarterback. Watkins is a 1,000-yard receiver. Spencer Brown's a former 1,000-yard rusher. Top to bottom, this is probably the most complete team. And elsewhere, you look at Louisiana Tech's a team that is always kind of in the mix. They're always winning 8-9 games in there. They got to replace a lot. They lose a quarterback, lose Amik Robertson, who went to the NFL. I think I'm going to give Skip Holtz the benefit of the doubt. He's done a really solid job.
He has done a good job, and I think he's gotten lost. It's like he is not a guy who is ever really in the mix for a bigger job. I think he's run through that to a certain degree, and I don't think he'll ever be a sexy name. But the fact of the matter is, you can put his track record against some guys who are quote unquote hot candidates and look at Skip Holtz and think like he's actually got a pretty good resume here compared to some of these other guys. But again, I think he is sort of settled in there at Louisiana Tech. It'll be interesting to see if he bounces or if he's able to bounce to another level. But they have been, right, along with UAB, one of the constants, or they have maybe even more so since Holtz got there, one of the constants in CUSA.
Yeah, and in the East, you talk about kind of bouncing up and down. FAU, They win 11 games in Lane Kiffin's first year, then they go 5-7. Then they win 11 games last year, win the conference again. Lane goes off to Ole Miss. Willie Taggart, takes over there. He lost his quarterback. Chris Robinson was removed from the team, I think last month or during camp. He is a guy who had a lot of off-field troubles. Now they need a new quarterback. They lose a ton on defense. They led the nation in turnover margin last year. They got to replace a lot there. But there is a lot of talent. Lane Kiffin really upgraded the talent. They are my pick to win the East, Willie Taggart and FAU. But I think it is pretty open. Western Kentucky, really last year defensively, top 25 defense in the country, very strong on that side of the ball. They need to figure out the quarterback situation and what they look like there. And then the other contender is Marshall, which walloped Eastern Kentucky 59-0 on Saturday. And Grant Wells, redshirt freshman quarterback, looked really good. And I know it's an FCS opponent, but Marshall lost their quarterback, Isaiah Green, to the transfer portal in the summer. And Wells looked like the real deal. So we'll see. I'm putting Marshall up higher than I initially thought. So those are probably the 5-6 teams I'm looking at in Conference USA right now. Yeah,
it was interesting because when Green left, it raised a lot of eyebrows. Like, oh, that's interesting. But now I kind of wonder if, and there was no regular off season, so it's hard to determine. Like there was, it's not like there was a spring, and Wells could have made up a lot of ground in the spring. But you do tend to wonder when these kids move on. The players are pretty sharp. If maybe he saw the writing on the wall with Wells, possibly. And again, Green was a pretty good player. Regardless, Wells played very nice against an FCS opponent, so maybe they do have something there. And as you mentioned, like in this conference, sometimes stability goes a long way, and Doc Holliday has been a guy who generally has done a pretty good job of keeping Marshall competitive. The other Conference USA team that we saw this past weekend very much looked like a team that did not want to be where it was, and that was Middle Tennessee. Just got stomped by Army. And again, that's a team that, generally speaking, has been more good than bad under Rick Stockstill for a long period of time. A lot of people thought that they would bounce back this year after a year where they had a fair amount of injuries last year. That, hey, listen, again, he does a good job. They should be back in the mix. But then that they lay that terrible egg on opening day. I have no idea what to make for some of these games. Maybe they are still going to be good. Did you take anything away from that Middle Tennessee performance that you think, oh, this is going to be a bad year? Or is it one of those, man, they didn't know they were playing Army until 3 weeks ago, and maybe they still didn't believe that they were playing Army?
I think it's a mix of both. I mean, I picked Middle Tennessee to finish last in the East. They just had a lot of questions on defense, and then you put that up against an Army team that I do think has rebuilt itself into what should be a pretty good team. They know what they're doing there. They score a touchdown on every single drive that they had, except for to run out the clock at the end, force 3 turnovers. They look like they have some playmakers, Army. So I think it's a mix of, preparing for a triple option team like that on short notice is tough, and a mix of Middle Tennessee was just not ready to play.
Okay, let's bounce to the American, because the American has established itself as, people in the Mountain West will maybe argue and push back against this, but I think the American they absolutely will, has established itself as the best of the group of 5 conferences as far as upper tier teams combined with depth. But again, if the Mountain West wants to argue, that's fine. Maybe not this year because you're not playing, but we can save that for another time. Going into this year, there's no doubt that the best of the remaining group of 5 conferences, and also because of the structure of college football, and 40% of the conferences are not playing this fall, or at least not starting anytime soon, it leads to this question. Is it possible that the American could have a team that breaks through and crashes into the playoff?
I think so. I mean, we did our staff picks for the playoff, and I put UCF in there. Part of it was just to spice things up a little bit, because otherwise we're all picking the same teams. But I do think they do have a chance. First off, they got to go undefeated. That's the only way this conversation is going to start. Second, you're going to need, the ACC, the Big 12, the SEC to kind of beat themselves up a bit. And it's possible with those expanded conference schedules. Now You've got Notre Dame in the ACC. You've got Alabama, Georgia, who play in the regular season. There is a chance that, you could have only one team in the SEC maybe has fewer than 2 losses. And does an undefeated UCF get in over a 2-loss Georgia? I think there could be a case to be made, especially with UCF's track record, and it can happen. I think UCF, Cincinnati, and Memphis are the only teams that would have a chance in the American, because they've got that track record, and based on where they start in the polls, it's going to be hard to move up in the polls this year without many non-conference games. So I think they've got a shot. I really do. But they got to go undefeated, and they got to hope the Power 5, Power 3 or whatever beat themselves up.
And the other part of it is you're in a good conference. So it's going to be tricky for UCF to run the table. And now, of course, I'm going to have to pull up UCF schedule, so you might hear some flipping in the background. But UCF has to play Cincinnati, if I remember correctly. I'm pretty sure they have Memphis again on there. So, and you're going to be dealing with a conference title game. So you're dealing with a pretty difficult conference to boot. When you handicap the top of that conference, I think SMU might be pretty good too, even though they didn't look particularly great against Texas State, but there was a lot of shooting themselves in a foot. I kind of got the impression from being in and out of that game, admittedly being in and out of that game, that SMU probably should have handled its business a little more comfortably in that game, if not for a few mistakes. Nonetheless, kudos to Texas State. But I feel like you've got a good 3 to 5 teams near the top of the American that can make some noise.
Yeah, there's a couple of tiers in this league. UCF, Cincinnati, and Memphis are the top tier. Now, Memphis gets dinged a little bit because Kenny Gainwell, the star running back, opted out a week before the season. So that hurts them a little bit. But, they were able to pull away and handle Arkansas State on Saturday. So those 3 are the 3 contenders for sure. SMU is probably in that mix. They're kind of, them and maybe Tulane are probably in that next tier. And then you've got, what is Houston going to look like in
That's
year
a
2
wild card, right?
So.
Houston seems to me, when I look at that, and you look at these things a little closer than I do, or really all the teams, because I have been so out of it. It feels like this offseason as far as boning up. But I sense that Houston is a wild card team, and the AAC is always a conference that produces a wild card.
Yeah, obviously that first year, 4-8 disaster. De'Aaron King, they decide to redshirt him because he doesn't want to play. And then he ends up transferring in the offseason. But, I think they have something like 30-something guys, I think, essentially redshirted last year, whether it was due to injuries or being a freshman or being a senior and you want another year. So they're going to have a lot of new players available this year that they didn't have last year. And you have to imagine they'll know the system better in year two. So I do expect an improvement from Houston. And yeah, it's probably a wild card. Is that an improvement to 7 or 8 wins, or is that an improvement to 9 or 10 wins and you're kind of in the mix for the conference? So we kind of got to wait and see, but they could really go anywhere.
So then the next tier becomes, is there anybody in that next tier, maybe a Temple comes to mind, who you think has a chance to maybe rise up and make a little noise and be a bit of a surprise? East Carolina showed some signs last year under Houston there that maybe that they could come a little faster. Then maybe that rebuild could maybe come about a little faster. What about that next tier of AAC teams?
Yeah, I mean, Temple, they're always pretty good. I don't see them being markedly better under Rod Carey this year. They should be solid again, make a bowl game. I don't know if they're going to compete for the title, though. I think East Carolina, I think 2021 is maybe the year you're looking for a breakthrough. Holden Ayers, the quarterback, really lit up the end of that season. They almost beat Cincinnati, probably should have beaten Cincinnati. They almost beat SMU, put up like 500 yards in both those games. They really turned a corner at the end. I'm curious to see this year how that momentum continues. But defensively, they've got a lot of problems. I think 2021 is when you're thinking ECU might make that breakthrough. But I expect a tough year for South Florida, first year under Jeff Scott. Tulsa, kind of unsure as well. So hard to see anybody else other than maybe Temple bumping up a bit.
So let's talk about Navy for a second, since we just saw Navy play, and clearly that was just a disaster. Ooh. Yeah, just a disaster. And again, this is not to take anything away from BYU, but Navy did not look prepared to play a football game. And Ken Numatalolo, who is a great coach, who was an absolutely fabulous coach, admitted afterward that he didn't get his team as prepared as he should have. They were just apprehensive to do a ton of hitting in the lead up to the game, and it led to one team looking like it hadn't played football in a while. So I say that as a setup to, this Navy team. I think a lot of people probably thought that they would be somewhere in your middle tier, right? Maybe that second to middle to middle third tier. Is it a possibility that they could recover from that and still end up having, like, in other words, in a couple of weeks, could you just see a completely different team, and all of a sudden by the end of the year, Navy looks like a bowl team again?
I mean, when I watched that game last night, there were problems that were deeper than just tackling. They got absolutely demolished on both sides of the line, and they lost 3 or 4 offensive line starters. And when I asked Niumatalolo about that in the offseason, he said, really, I feel fine about that group. I think we're always good there. He said, it doesn't matter who comes in and leaves. We're always really solid. I have faith in the guys, faith in the coaches. He thought they'd be fine there. They were not fine on the offensive line. And when you have a new quarterback like Dalen Jones coming in with almost no experience, it ended up being the disaster that we saw. So if they need to be a lot better on the lines before anything else happens. And can that improve in the next handful of weeks? It's possible. Maybe they're going to hit more in practice and it's going to help. But I do think it was simply more than tackling dummies that were Navy's problems.
Okay, so you have UCF actually making the playoff, but who do you like? Is it another UCF Memphis championship game? We had 2 of those in the two not last year, but the 2 years previous. And then last year, Memphis breaks through and Memphis beats Cincinnati. Cincinnati has been, let's maybe stop on Cincinnati for a second because they deserve a little more time. They're ranked in the preseason. Luke Fickell's really got a nice program going over there. I mean, Cincinnati is a program that, generally speaking, if you have a solid coach there, and they tend to draw pretty solid coaches, you should do pretty well at Cincinnati. The guts of the program at Cincinnati are built to be somewhat successful, and Fickell's done a nice job there. So let's land on Cincinnati for a second, and then I'll have you have you answer the question: who will UCF be playing in the AAC championship game?
Yeah, that defense should be really, really, really good this year. Not only did Luke Fickell turn down Michigan State head coaching job, but Marcus Freeman as well. defensive coordinator opted not to join Mel Tucker's staff at Michigan State. So they should be good there. Offensively, they lost Warren, the really good running back. Got to find a little bit more weapons there. I had picked Memphis to be the other team in the conference championship game. So the American has 11 teams this year. After UConn left, top 2 teams will play for the conference title game. I initially had UCF versus Memphis, but after Kenny Gainwell opted out, I think I have to lean towards Cincinnati this time. Cincinnati does get Memphis at home on the regular season schedule. So I'm going to say Cincinnati does get that second spot in the conference title game.
So and again, take Chris's picks, not mine, because I had to make some picks today. And I thought, you know what? Again, the AAC, it's always a little fun in the AAC. So let me find somebody a little outside the norm, because I knew it was going to be a lot of UCF, Cincinnati, maybe UCF, Memphis. And I didn't go that far to the extreme. I didn't go Tulane, even though I was tempted because I think Willie Fritz does a great job. But I did go SMU. They do bring a lot of guys back. They are it is counterintuitive for me though, because I am always very leery of teams that have these breakout years and win a fair amount of close games. And that was sort of the SMU template last year. They also didn't finish particularly well, because I always figured there's just going to be some reversion to the mean. Not that they're going to get much worse, but by the simple nature of a few close games flipping one way or the other, they go from being a 10-win team last year to an 8 or 9-win team this year. Maybe as good a team, but just not as many wins. However, I rolled the dice with SMU. Chris is going UCF and Cincinnati. And who knows, again, if you get the right mix there, maybe UCF, Cincinnati are playing for a possible playoff spot. Like the winner could possibly go. Yeah,
I mean, I also think SMU, could have a shot. A couple of years ago, nobody saw UCF coming out of nowhere to do what they did. And then, SMU does it last year. So picking someone outside of the norm is certainly not unusual with the American. My biggest concerns with SMU are replacing the front 7 guys, and Texas State was able to run the ball quite a bit on them, and losing Rhett Lashley, the offensive coordinator, to Miami, and hiring Garrett Riley, Lincoln Riley's brother, to run the offense. So SMU certainly could definitely be in that spot. But the American should be really fun this year. It was rated higher than the ACC.
Yes.
In the Sagarin ratings for much of the year. I don't know if it was by the end, but there's a lot of depth in this league. It should be better. UCF should probably be better than last year. Cincinnati should be just as good. Memphis maybe a step down. SMU maybe the same. Tulane should be better. Houston should be better. This is going to be a very fun league to watch.
Okay, so let's hit the Sun Belt, where, as I referenced before, you have 2 pretty damn good teams at the top of the Sun Belt. They've played for the conference championship the last couple of years, Appalachian State, Louisiana. They are pretty much, look to me like the overwhelming favorites to do it again. Anybody in the Sun Belt? Well, let's start with this. Let's start with giving those 2 teams a little shine. Will App State and Louisiana be as good as they have been the last couple of years when they were quite good?
Yeah, I think so. App State brings almost everything back on offense. They had a receiver opt out a few days ago, but they bring pretty much everything back on offense. They got a senior quarterback, a bunch of senior receivers. I think the whole line might be back, maybe 4 guys. They should be just as good as they've been the last few years. They've won a share of at least 4 or 5 straight conference titles. I expect them to 100% be in the mix again, maybe in the mix for the playoff if they're undefeated. And it sucks because they were supposed to go to Wake Forest and Wisconsin this year.
Yeah.
And that would have been so much fun. And instead, we don't get that. Louisiana, same type of deal. They bring pretty much everybody back on both sides of the ball. Lose their defensive coordinator, Ron Roberts, who did a really good job. He is now the DC at Baylor. But I do expect these 2 teams to be a good couple of steps above everybody else in the conference.
Who else is interesting in that conference? Maybe get into the mix, maybe scare App State. It seems like Georgia Southern has been, is a team that maybe could be an upset the apple cart team. But who do you like as the possibilities to at least scare Louisiana and App State? Yeah,
Georgia Southern has beaten Appalachian State the last 2 years. The the only conference games that App State has lost. That's a huge rivalry, and for whatever reason, Georgia Southern has their number right now, and they're going to get them at home this year. Shai Werts, the quarterback, will be a senior. They bring everybody back who had a rushing yard in 2019. So Georgia Southern should be able to take a step up. Their problems have been, they beat Appalachian State, and then I think they lost the next week both times. So it's the other games that have been problems. And then I think Arkansas State could be in the mix. I was a little disappointed by their performance on Saturday against Memphis. That third quarter, they kind of crumbled in a few ways. They had some turnovers. They give up a fake punt. And, they fought back to the end as much as they could, but they've got really good quarterbacks in Logan Bonner and Lane Hatcher. They got to find some new spots on defense. But that's a team that should score a lot of points, a lot more than we saw on Saturday. So I think Arkansas State could potentially jump in that mix as well.
Any of the team? Well, it's okay. We saw a few Sun Belt teams this past weekend. We saw Texas State again account itself fairly well, second year under Jake Spavital, and again that's not a program that's had a ton of success, but acquitted itself pretty well. We saw a South Alabama team in its third year. Is it third year now under Steve Campbell or second year under Steve Campbell? Third year under Steve Campbell, who was a guy I used to know from his time at Delta State when I was working in Mississippi. Any of those sort of like the next tier of Sun Belt teams that you're interested in? Maybe again, just the ones we saw to see maybe there is something good brewing in one of those schools, or anybody else off there that you think, what, this is a team I could see making some steps forward this year.
Yeah, it's actually South Alabama. That was the team I was really interested in coming into the year. They were a mess most of 2019. They scored 10 points per game in their first 9 games against FBS opponents, but they go 1-3 in their final 4 games and scored 26 points per game when then freshman Desmond Trotter took over at quarterback. And he clearly liked throwing to Jalen Tolbert, who had 4 touchdowns in the season finale win against Arkansas State. And that very much carried over into that Southern Miss opener. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but Jalen Tolbert,
he was
had
good. He was really good again.
Touchdowns. Yeah. I think he had 169 yards, maybe receiving, and Desmond Trotter, now redshirt sophomore, looked quite good. So perhaps South Alabama is turning the corner here under Steve Campbell in year 3, because that Trotter to Tolbert connection, I had a lot of high expectations for, and it looks like that is certainly going to be the thing that carries them.
The thing I'd like to see, and I'd like to see it in part because, again, I had to make some predictions because I'm contractually obligated, right? We have to predict these things.
We all are.
And I have to make New Year's Day, New Year's 6 bowl predictions. And there's only 6 conferences playing, so you run out of teams really quickly. And instead of putting 7 SEC teams in those 12 spots, I found myself thinking, all right, where can we find something interesting, right? Just as you said, I hate to just go chalk all the time. Where can I find something interesting to do with these games and these teams? And I found myself thinking, Louisiana and App State are both very, very good. I could see them getting to a point where the winner of that conference is good enough and ranked high enough that it could squeeze into a New Year's 6 game. Maybe not the playoff, but a New Year's 6 game. So what the hell? I rolled the dice and I picked that. And I actually picked Louisiana to do it. The other thing is Louisiana has a big game coming up this weekend, maybe one of the most interesting games on the slate this weekend. Yeah. As I talked about previously with our first guest, at Ames against a pretty good Iowa State team. What do you think? What do you think of Louisiana's chances of rolling into Ames and coming away with a victory that really, as crazy as it sounds, could very much change the landscape of the season as far as big bowl games, because all of a sudden the Sun Belt has a little credibility built in if one of those 2 big teams goes on a big run. Yeah, there are not a lot of great Group of 5 upsets, Power 5 opportunities this year. One of them is this one, Louisiana at Iowa State. I picked Iowa State to win by 3. I think it's going to be close. I think Louisiana has a lot of experience, and if this wasn't maybe week 1, you know a little bit more about teams, and week 1, especially with everything going on, can be extremely strange.
and you got a new defensive coordinator again at Louisiana. But I think Louisiana's got a shot, and it would do wonders for the Sun Belt if that happens because, App State has beaten Louisiana 4 times in the last 2 years. And as good as they are, especially last year, the problem is when you play them again in a conference championship game and you beat them, it devalues your previous win against them.
Yeah, to a certain degree, right?
Yeah,
that's weird.
So
right?
you're going to need some of these opportunities. And South Alabama hosts Tulane as well on a Saturday night ESPN2 game. That's a big one for the Sun Belt to try to make a statement. So anywhere the Sun Belt can try to pick up some of these wins that could then be fed to a Louisiana or an Appalachian State would certainly do wonders.
Chris Vannini is the Athletics Group of 5 beat writer. He does a tremendous job. And again, if those teams are your teams and your conferences, grab yourself a subscription to The Athletic and follow along with Chris. He does Group of 5 notebook every week and roundups, and again, we'll give you better coverage of those teams than you get from most. Your local outlets are great. We encourage you buying your local newspapers to stay on top of those teams, absolutely. But Chris will give you a good overview to supplement that coverage at The Athletic. So, Chris, hey, thanks a lot for joining me today and giving a little insight on what we can expect from the Group of 5 this year.
Yep, you're going to see a lot more of them in primetime type games. So there's a lot of good football in the Group of 5/Group of 3 now, and I hope you guys check it out. Thanks for having me, Ralph.
Yeah, you're welcome, and that's an excellent point. You're going to see a lot more of these teams now because there's some room on these television dials. So definitely bone up on your Group of 5. And now 3 and out, first down. The chatter from Big Ten country has been constant, but frankly, I don't think much has fundamentally changed with the conference in the last couple of weeks. We are taping this on a Tuesday. I thought by now we might have heard from the conference with a 2-track plan. One for when the season could be played, maybe a plan A and a plan B, and one for what medical benchmarks related to COVID-19 needed to be hit in each Big Ten state for the return to play plan to be put in action. I wouldn't be shocked if by the time you listen to this, some kind of plan has been revealed. I would be shocked if the Big Ten started any earlier than maybe early November. Remember, if the conference presidents changed their minds tomorrow and said every team could play ASAP, it would still take about a month for preseason practice to be complete. That would put the Big Ten into mid-October to start a season at the earliest. At this point, the Big Ten would probably be better off seeing how the first few weeks of the season go for the conferences that are playing. As much criticism as the conference has taken, it's fair to point out that there is a possibility a few months from now, the Big Ten's decision could be validated if the other conferences really struggle to complete a season that looks legitimate. I'm not saying that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 were right or wrong, but we will all know for sure a lot more in a couple of months. Second down. Cole Cubelek made mention of this, but there are players who are arriving on campus and within a couple of weeks starting football games for their new schools. Jake Burton is listed as Baylor's starting right tackle after transferring from UCLA just a couple of weeks ago. Linebacker Colin Schooler earned a starting job at Texas Tech 10 days after he officially transferred from Arizona. Football is a very complicated game, and understanding and mastering schemes, as Cole mentioned, is an important thing and could be a difference this season in what teams have varying levels of success. But it still comes down to athletic people blocking and tackling. Guys like Schooler and Burton rolling into town and into starting lineups are a good example that first and foremost, what determines who plays is talent. Third down. I guess I'll give my SEC picks now since Cole gave his. In a season of uncertainty, I'll stick with the surest thing and take Alabama. I was tempted to come off of my Georgia to win the SEC East pick, but I still think the Dogs will be so good on the defensive side that they'll make another SEC title game run. Alabama wins the conference, and I'm picking the Tide, of course, to get back to the playoff. Beating UCF in the first round, yeah, I'll take a shot on the Knights just to be different, like my second guess, Chris Vannini. My other playoff pairing is Clemson against Texas, which will win the Big 12. I'll go with Clemson versus Alabama in the national title game for the fourth time in CFP history, and the Tide winning a sixth national championship under Nick Saban. Again, in these uncertain times, go with the sure thing, and Clemson, Alabama is as close as we can get to a sure thing. We'll see come December if we get any of these things actually played. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.